Today I'm going to tell you a story, and it's a story that will probably sound familiar. There was a large gathering of people. They were there because they had an issue that was important to them. It was dear to their heart. It was a cause they rallied behind. Speeches were made. Emotions were aroused and passions inflamed. One thing led to another, and before you know it, it got loud. It got a bit violent and destructive. What started simple had become a mob, and this mob got into a riot. Now, when you hear that, you may be thinking, I know exactly what you're talking about. But you know, if you've got any one particular situation in mind, I remind you, this is pretty commonplace. All through our lifetime, we've seen this kind of thing happen. We see it in the news as a gathering turns a bit more destructive than what they started. It becomes a mob, a riot. It happens a lot. And it happens for a variety of reasons. And so, for example, we'll have political causes. And it could be you're on this side or that side. It doesn't matter which side you're on. Both sides will look at the other side, and before you know it, they get so upset that what it started friendly gets into something more. We've seen it done for social issues as well. All types of issues that get us riled up. It could be on race matters. It could be on those immigrants that are coming into our country. It could be on sexual identity and practice, or related to things like abortion and all other issues. We've seen people get their passions aroused to the point. What we have now is more of a mob. It's a riot. And oftentimes the end results are consequences that have to be dealt with. Yeah, this is a fact of life, and it's been this way all through history. But the story I want to tell you about today is not one from our times. It's one from the times of the New Testament. It's from the book of Acts, chapter 19. It's the riot that took place in a theater in Ephesus. This month I've been telling you the story of Ephesus as Paul did his ministry there. We're in Acts chapter 19. He came to the great city of Ephesus, one of the greatest cities of its day. It was a city where he had the biggest impact for the gospel. He did more there than any other place, but he also had to deal with the challenges of Ephesus. And as Paul is doing his ministry in Ephesus, Paul is doing it near what Ephesus was most famous for, the temple of Artemis. Sometimes we refer to it as the Temple of Diana, the Greek name, but it's the Temple of Artemis. Now, Artemis, the goddess of heaven, had this great temple that was built by Alexander the Great. That's back in the 4th century BC. And when this thing was built, it became the biggest building that we know of in the ancient world. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, as we call it today. Now, the size was impressive. 420 feet long, 220 feet wide, and 127 columns that rose up to about 60 feet. And if you want to just imagine its size, because it's not there today, it's gone, but perhaps you've seen pictures of Athens, Greece. You've seen the Parthenon. You've seen the great temple there. That's an impressive temple. This was 4 times the size of that. This temple of Artemis was famous over the world of that day, and it was what gave Ephesus its reputation. An impressive thing. But Paul comes to town. He's preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in the process, he's changing people's minds and their attitudes. He's changing their ways. And in doing so, there were those who were loyal to the temple of Artemis and all that it stood for the great city of Ephesus, and they felt threatened by Paul and by his preaching of the gospel. That's going to lead to conflict. So Paul preached for 3 years. He's preaching, he's teaching, and the conflict is growing and building till it finally reached a climax. And what we're going to see in today's message is a great opposition against the gospel that Paul was preaching. Now, you know, opposition to the gospel, that's kind of old news for a veteran like Paul. You go back to Jesus. Jesus had to deal with the Pharisees and the Sadducees after him all the time. The apostles in the early chapters of Acts, dealing with the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem and having trouble day after day after day. And as you follow Paul throughout the book of Acts, he's got trouble every town he goes to. He stays for a while until he wears out his welcome. People don't like that gospel, and they force him to move on. Opposition to the gospel was a commonplace thing. But in Ephesus, it rose to a pitch level that ultimately was a riot. Here's how Luke begins the story as he's writing the book of Acts. He says, there arose a great disturbance about the way. Now, that was what we called Christianity back in those days, the way, following Jesus, the way. There arose a great disturbance, a riot. Now, what happened was you had a large number of people gathered together for a cause I'll tell you about in just a moment. And as they did, it got to be too many to fit in the street. That's where it began. As it filled up and you couldn't even hear the guy that's speaking, they decided to roll it into the great theater of Ephesus. Well, it's an impressive thing. You can still see the ruins of it today. Estimated it would seat up to 25,000 people. Now, that doesn't mean that's how many people came and were part of this riot. No, but whatever the number, it was more than would fit in the street. And so let's imagine the hundreds, maybe even the thousands of people that gathered in that theater ready to do what happens next. And what happened? Well, I will tell you, for the next 2 hours, it was madness. As Luke describes it, he uses the word commotion. He'll use the word riot. It was a riot in the theater. Now, when I look at this story and I think about it, and then I think about our modern times as well, I got the practical question, how does this happen? I mean, how do people who start off doing whatever it is they're doing, next thing you know, they get drawn into something like this, a mob, a riot? How does that happen? It's good for us to know because I don't want you to get in trouble. Getting pulled into some mob somewhere, next thing you know, you're arrested and calling me for your bail money. I don't want that to happen. You say, it's not likely. I wouldn't do that. Maybe not. But sometimes in discussing with people the issues of the day at which we have differences, well, before you know it, we can sometimes get ourselves wound up to a point that we may say something or do something that was out of character, certainly out of our Christian character, and afterwards may have some regrets and may have to say a few apologies. It is easy to get drawn into something because you feel passionate about it. And so I want to take this riot in the theater of Ephesus and break it down for you. I want to show you what the pieces were that made it all come together. That way you can be on your guard and know how to control your passion, your emotions, and to deal with things in life in the way that Christ would have us do. Now, it began first with insightful rhetoric. And when I say the word insightful, I don't mean the other spelling in which, that was a very good observation. You were thinking deep. No, not that kind of insightful. This is to stir up and to agitate. And it starts with someone who's going to get up and make a speech and use the rhetoric of words and get people stirred up. The someone in this case was Demetrius, the silversmith. He's identified by Luke. Now, who was he? He's a guy that made his trade, his living, by making little idols and other trinkets related to the temple of Artemis. He'd make those things and then sell them to all the people who came in from around the world to visit this temple, and so that's how he made his living. Now, what he did was he got together with the other shop owners around him that made whatever crafts they made, silver and otherwise, and he told them, we got a problem, and the problem is a guy named Paul. Of course, everybody in Ephesus knows Paul. He's been around preaching 3 years. This man, Paul, is causing us trouble. We got to do something about it. And he put out charges and accusations, strong charges. Yeah, that's where it begins, with somebody with some speech making and putting out there a perceived threat. And that was the second piece of it, a perceived threat. In his mind, and he believed in the mind of his friends, we've got a threat. I think we all can see it. Now, he named a couple of threats that Paul was bringing to their city. First, there was a threat against the temple of Artemis. Paul's talking is leading to people not coming to the temple. They're moving away. He's going to bring our great temple into ruin. It's going to come collapsing down and fall. That's how he's stirring it up with his rhetoric. He's going to bring down the temple of Artemis. And with that's our reputation as the city of Ephesus. Got him stirred up about the temple. But it came closer to home in what he really was after when he said, also, he's threatening our livelihood. He's after our money. And Luke does mention more than once in this passage that the profit they made from selling what they sold was a considerable profit. And he says he is threatening our prosperity. Yeah, it came down to the pocketbook. And Paul is cutting into our income. Now, when he says that, it is true that if Christianity rises, people will stop going to pagan temples and stop buying the trinkets, and they'll be out of business. So he's got a legitimate threat in that sense. But I'll tell you, that's where the gospel always works. The gospel of Jesus Christ will often challenge you and say, if you want to be a Christian and be a real, genuine Christian, you may have to change something you're doing. You may have to let something go. The gospel always does that with every one of us. And it may force you, for example, to have to change the work you're doing to something else because that vocation isn't consistent with Christian values. It may be that it comes after your lifestyle, your habits, your practices. It may come after the way you speak, and the list can go on of the changes that may be required if you are going to accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, Demetrius is playing up this threat to the city, to the temple, the threat to those of us who make our living off of the temple of Artemis. Now, as he's doing all of that, he then leads them to an emotional response. He goes for the emotions. That's what rhetoric often does. It sometimes bypasses the mind and rational reasoning and just goes straight to the heart and stirs it up. And that's what Luke says. Oh, they got agitated. They got stirred up. They got angry, filled with wrath and fury over this thing. Now, that's where I got to pause and remind you of something we always need to remember. And that is, whatever issues that we care about, it's okay to care about them. It's okay to feel emotions and passion, but keep them under control. We always want to be rational when we make our decisions of what to say and what to do, and not let emotions lead us, because that gets us in trouble. You're angry, and then that's when you choose to say something, you may say the wrong thing. Paul says, let that anger cool down first before you say something, unless you are angry and sin. And that sometimes happens. Now, when I look at this formula so far, what I'm seeing is what goes on all the time around us. You can't avoid it. We've got people all around us who want your attention because they're going to tell you about something that they believe you ought to be as upset as they are, and they'll lay it out for you. And as this person gives you whatever rhetoric they've got that's designed to stir you up, they'll tell you stories, they'll tell you things, and you'll say, boy, if that's true, I'm mad. We all should be mad. Let's do something about it. Now, I caution you, because everybody's out there doing it, and doing it from both sides. You get it from our news medias. They sit there in the news times, and not like the old days where you just report the stories, but now report the stories from a perspective. And we've got both perspectives out there. You also get it as you go on the social media, postings on Facebook or tweets and this and that. Whatever happens, people are coming at you, and they are putting in front of you something that is designed to stir you up and get you feeling what you feel. So just be cautious. Don't let it rouse you to the point that you say or do something inappropriate. You always want to control your action. In the case of the people at Ephesus, they did not control their action. What happened next was a mob action. Oh yeah, that's what we see, because Luke describes it, and I'll tell you, he uses the word shouting a lot, because this thing got loud and out of control. Now with this shouting, it starts first in the area where the merchants were that made those silver items for the temple. As Demetrius doing his speech, he's got all of them there, and they're going with him. They got the hands raised in the air, I can imagine, and they're shouting with him, yes, yes, yes. And at some point, they start to shout, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. That's probably a traditional chant anyway, but he's got them going, and they're just repeating it over and over. That just gets them stirred up. Now, around the rest of the town, they can hear a noise coming from that quarter. Probably couldn't hear exactly what all is being said. Maybe make out a word or two, like Artemis, for example, or Ephesians. Whatever they hear, though, it's got them curious, and they start to move that direction. They want to know what's going on. And as the shouting continues and others join in, it gets loud and loud. It gets a crowd that's big enough they got to move into the theater. And here's what Luke says. They get in the theater, and still people aren't quite sure exactly what they're shouting about. So he says they shouted different things. Some over here shouted one thing, some shouting something different, and related, unrelated, they're shouting different things. And then Luke makes this note. He says, and most of the people there weren't even quite sure exactly why we came, because they didn't hear the initial speech. They just saw the commotion, the shouting, and something's going on. You know what that's like. You see a crowd of people, they're rushing somewhere. You're curious. I want to see what's going on. You can't even drive on the interstate past an accident without turning to look to see what's going on over there. And people rushed into the theater, some not even knowing what they were there for. However, if that traditional chant breaks out, "Great is Artemis," they're going to join in, because after all, that is a tradition for them. And so, yes, that shouting continued to get louder and louder and louder. It went on for 2 hours. I mean, that's a bit out of control when you think about that. A man got up to try to speak to the crowd. Jews asked him to step up. And as he got up, he was introduced, and he was introduced as one of the leaders at the Jewish synagogue. And when they heard Jewish, they just shouted him down. They didn't even want to hear what he had to say. In their minds, they associated Jews, Christians, pretty much the same thing. They weren't. They were different. That's how they thought. But you know, that shouting down, people still do that today. You don't like what somebody's saying, just talk over them. And we'll do it sometimes as a crowd, but we'll do it sometimes in just normal conversation where I just stop you right where you are, and I'm going to take the floor. And that's rude. That's not the Christian way to do it. It's certainly not a rational way to carry on a conversation. But you see that happening in this bunch as they shout down the speaker. Well, as they do this, then things are just getting out of hand, and the shouting continued on and on and on. And what you have here is now a mob action. That is, once it started, it's hard to stop that kind of thing. But you know, that kind of action leads to some wrong conduct, disorderly conduct. And so that's what happens. They start to do things, and I'll show you in just a moment what they were, that are unlawful and certainly improper, things that were wrong. Now, let me tell you, in this story, there were some cool heads. Not in that theater, obviously. But for example, the disciples that Paul had won there at Ephesus, they were with Paul. And Paul was determined, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to speak to those people. They said, they'll kill you. I'm ready to die for Christ. I'm sure his attitude was. But they said, yeah, but that's not what we're doing. And they held him back, it says. They wouldn't let him go. And then some of the city officials showed up where Paul was. And they told him, we don't want you in there. You'll make the situation worse. Right now, that's our problem. We got to do something, bring it under control, but you won't be helping us. And so you stay away. And so Paul stayed away. That's cooler heads prevailing. And then there was one man that stands out. He's, to me, like the hero of the story, the town clerk. Now, what his actual role officially is hard to describe. We just get the title. But he's going to be something of the equivalent of the mayor of a big city, someone they would respect. He goes in, and when he tells the crowd to quiet down, they quiet down. In fact, in their minds, they may be thinking, here's the guy that will get something done. We're going to finally get to do something about Paul. But he quiets them down. Now, to his credit, he's there to bring order and peace, not to go against Paul or anything else. In fact, in a very nice way, as you read his little speech, he will challenge what they've done today, challenge their conduct and behavior, and try to point them in a better direction. Listen to what he talks about. First, he talks about their threats of violence. It started with two men they grabbed on the way into the theater. They grabbed a man named Gaius and Aristarchus. Now, those are friends of Paul. They're friends of Paul that he's training to be evangelists and preachers. He's using them in his ministry. They can't find Paul, so they grab these two guys. Now, they're basically scapegoats, substitutes for Paul. If we can't take out our wrath on Paul, we'll take it out on somebody else. And so as they drag them in, they're ready to do something to them. The town clerk says, wait a minute. Why are these two fellows here? What I've heard for the last 2 hours is your beef with Paul. You got a beef with Paul, deal with Paul, but what are these two men here for? That's wrong. And he challenged them for taking their anger and diverting it to someone else. Yeah, they were wrong. I think that's a great way to ask the question, what are these men doing here? Your direction is wrong. There was also unsubstantiated charges. And this is where he takes what was said by Demetrius, what the crowd's been repeating. And he says, so I hear the charges against Paul. Where are the facts behind those charges? So what charges? And then he lays them out for him. He says, so you say that Paul is a threat to the temple. He's going to bring this thing crashing down. And yet from what I see, he hasn't actually gone to your temple and plundered your temple, even touched a stone of your temple. I'm not seeing where he's actually a threat to your temple. He just says words. Words won't hurt a temple of stone. Not only that, you say blasphemy against Artemis. But I heard what Demetrius said, Paul said. He quoted him. Paul said, you know, when you make something out of silver, that's not really a god. Demetrius, you don't actually think those little trinkets you sell are gods, do you? The gods are in heaven. That's just a trinket. That's what Paul said. So I'm not sure that rises to the level of blasphemy. You know what he's saying? Basically, you got wound up over what you perceived as Paul was doing wrong, but you don't have it backed up with facts. Always remember that, folks. Don't just listen to the rhetoric. Check the facts and see if it's exactly like you were told. And then he says, there's unlawful action here. You're about to do something to these two men and whatever else you get a hold of, but that's unlawful. You got a grievance against Paul, take him to court. Courts are open right now. That's how we settle matters in a lawful way. Take them to court, not a mob action doing what they do. You know, bottom line for what the town clerk says is something you and I need to memorize. In all of life, there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And he said, folks, what you're doing today is the wrong way to do it. I feel that way about the mobs and riots that we have seen in our news, the ones we see throughout history. That's the wrong way to deal with things. Now, sometimes we'll try to justify, if they're on the right side, a cause we identify with. We'll say, yeah, their heart's in the right place. Yeah, but what they did was wrong. We'll say, yes, but no one was listening, so they had to get their attention. But what they did was wrong. All that pent-up frustration that they had to release, what they did was wrong. There's a right way and a wrong way, and this is not the way to do it. In a lawful society, as the town clerk says, or as a Christian representing the gospel of Jesus Christ. What they did was wrong. I look at this story, I realize people starting off with something simple, with an issue that they cared about. Before you know it, it got out of hand. They did some things they'll have to back away from. In fact, the last thing he tells them is this. There'll be an accounting for what happened today. It may not be to your liking. You know what he's threatening them with? Some of you may find yourself in court having an answer for what you did today, because what you did was unlawful. It was wrong. He told them to go home, and so they tucked their tail and they went home. And that was the end of the riot in Ephesus. You know how that thing turned out? Well, it failed in that it didn't stop Paul from preaching the gospel. He'll take on and keep on preaching. And his evangelists, they'll keep spreading the word as well. And it didn't stop the fall of paganism and the temple of Artemis and the selling of the materials, because as Christianity grew throughout the world, the Romans and the Greeks, they started to move away from that kind of thinking. Polytheism and idols. They started moving the direction of a creator God, one God, the kind of thing Paul preached everywhere he went. That's the direction they went as a culture. Yeah, the riot failed to stop all of that. And here's the thing I like the best of all. The gospel just kept right on moving. Moving forward, bringing people to Christ. You really can't stop the gospel of Jesus Christ, because it's always going to keep going despite the opposition we face. But I got to caution you. As I look at this tale, I see the gospel prevailing as it does. I want you to always be a representative of the gospel in everything you say and do. A good witness who does things in a Christ-like manner. Don't let the rhetoric of our day draw you into things that you shouldn't say or do. Don't let the passion of your heart for good causes lead you to say and do what you shouldn't do. Always restrain yourself, discipline yourself, control yourself, so that in all situations you represent the gospel of Jesus Christ as best you can, so that through that gospel, in our words and in our life, we can bring people to Jesus Christ. Father, we thank you. We thank you for this story that's in your word. Reminds us of the hardships of being an evangelist back in those early days, the opposition that preachers often faced, but the perseverance they had in such times and the way the gospel prevailed. Help us, Father, to be a people who are still putting that gospel word out there to our family, our friends, our neighbors, helping people to know Jesus as we know him, bringing them to the salvation of Jesus Christ. We pray in Jesus' holy and blessed name. Amen.